to my listening ears. All nature sings and round me rings the music of the spheres. This is my Father's world. I rest me in the thought of rocks and trees, of skies and...
Good morning and happy Thanksgiving to everyone. This is 20 pages a week. We're reading all the way through the Bible. We are nearing the end of the New Testament with a big reading in 1st and 2nd Corinthians this week. And I personally am thankful this week that Casey Gray is with us to discuss this topic, this reading. Casey, thank you so much for being here.
I'm excited to be here, excited to be studying with you. Looking forward to our study today.
Casey is one of these guys who has plans over the holidays, kind of strange how that works. And so he has graciously agreed to record early with us. We're talking on Monday morning, actually, at this particular juncture. If you want to leave comments in the chat, please go ahead and do so. We love the comments. We love responding to them, but obviously we will not be responding to them live. Casey, I was telling Casey before we went on the air, it had to get a real pro to come in this week because 1st and 2nd Corinthians is a big read. It's a complicated read. Lots of controversial stuff in there. Lots of very interesting rabbit trails to chase down. We want to make sure we got some strong hands on the wheel for a week like this. So, Casey, why don't you just go ahead and start by giving us first impressions of 1st and 2nd Corinthians?
All right. So, whenever I was reading through these books, the thing that I'd say stands out to me is God's grace toward his people, because you remember the Corinthians are mainly a Gentile group that whenever you read through 1 Corinthians, you just see so many problems that they have. And it's just problem after problem that's all the result of their selfishness. And maybe it's tied to the way that they were brought up, or maybe it's just stuff that's happened since they've become Christians that's kind of turned them to that. But they're very selfish people. But God is gracious toward them. And whenever we get to the end of 1 Corinthians and whenever we get to 2 Corinthians, we see that Paul doesn't have the impression that God has forsaken them or abandoned them. It's not like you're going to be studying Galatians. It's not like he says, "You foolish Corinthians." He doesn't do that. There's still a sense in which, even though these people are making tons of mistakes, they're still saved. God loves them. And so that's really the first impressions that I get from studying both of these books.
Well, that's such a great point. I don't know about you, but for me as a preacher, it's very easy to quit on people. It's very easy to assume I've been preaching here for 6 months, I've been preaching here for a year, 2 years, whatever the number is, and I'm not making a difference. These people are carnal. These people are shallow. These people don't really love each other. I'm not accomplishing very much here. I need to do something else, and sometimes that's appropriate. Sometimes it's right to go ahead and pick up and move along. But your point is so well taken there. Paul did good work for 18 months. Jesus told him himself, I have much people here. Paul had an emotional and time investment with these people, and he didn't consider it to be wasted. He didn't think he was just spinning his wheels. And the Corinthians gave him plenty of opportunity to quit. They were just wrong on some of them anyway, were wrong on such fundamental things, not understanding what the Lord's Supper was, not understanding what the resurrection was, not understanding about basic, decent morality and proper conduct. It's crazy how wrong they were. Some of them, again, how wrong some of them were. And Paul continues to work with them, writes letter after letter to them, expressing confidence. The positivity in 2 Corinthians, at least from time to time, it's positive. It's not always positive. But it's just really encouraging to me that Paul sees life and possibility in these people.
Yeah. I mean, in the in First Corinthians, he ends the letter with a very positive note, talking about the resurrection. And he talks about in First Corinthians 15, the fact that they are being saved if they hold fast to Christ. It's just a reminder that, you've got all these things that you need to fix that are wrong with you. You're divisive, you're sexually immoral, you're idolatrous, you are messing up your worship services. I mean, there's just this huge list, but then he ends it with this positive note of, but you're being saved because you're holding fast to the faith you have in Christ. And then Second Corinthians comes in, and it's just, let me build you up. Let me encourage you, because apparently you've got men who've come in who act like they're the stuff, that they're the greatest, and that they're better than we are as apostles. And I want you to understand our ministry. I want you to understand the purpose of, our work and what we're doing. And I want you to be built up to do the same work that we're doing. It's kind of like, are these the same people that you were talking to in First Corinthians? Like, how are you encouraging them to enter into ministry that is spreading the gospel? It's like they wouldn't be qualified for that. But I feel like that's essentially the message in Second Corinthians, is to build them up so that they can be transformed as they behold the glory of Christ, and become like Christ, and become like Paul, and become ambassadors like Paul is an ambassador. So really, really encouraging to take the two books together and see you're messing up on all this stuff, but I have great hope for you. It's really cool.
I forget who it was that was commenting along these lines recently that I heard, but comparing the distinction that we want to make between ourselves and our brethren in the context of both of us trying to become like Jesus, and the gap between the righteous one, the so-called righteous one, and Jesus is so much bigger than any kind of gap that we might perceive between us and our brother. It gets to be such a ridiculous comparison kind of thing. If Jesus is really the mark, then we don't have any business looking down on the Corinthians. We don't have any business looking down on the Galatians, even to a certain degree. The idea that I'm so much better than them, I've almost made it, and they don't even know what road they're on. That's not an appropriate comparison for us to be making.
Yeah, that just sounds a lot like the Pharisees and everybody that Jesus was against. That is not poor in spirit kind of an attitude. It's not humility. And I think it's very easy to fall into that trap whenever we read letters where Paul is, rebuking, like you said, Galatians and Corinthians, to say, man, I can't believe how evil those people are. Look at them. And we do that throughout the Old Testament, right? We go through the Old Testament and we look at how foolish those Israelites are. And we don't realize that it's trying to show us who we are and how we make those same mistakes. And so we waste our time studying the Old Testament, and instead of using that to understand ourselves and to grow spiritually, which is really what we should be really more focused on than making ourselves feel better by looking at other people and saying, man, they're so foolish.
Absolutely. All right. Well, there are a few storylines that we might be wanting to follow in the Corinthian letters. Why don't you pick one for me?
All right. So, I had a few different stories to choose from. Let me see. I think I'm going to go with the story that's in Second Corinthians, which is basically chapters 10 through 13, which is Paul's explanation of his ministry, and the example that Paul is giving the Corinthians, that his ministry is about suffering. Essentially, what happens there is the Corinthians are looking for these false teachers and seeing all their accomplishments, and Paul's upset about that because they're being led astray from the cross, from living like Christ. So I love this story because he starts off saying, I really don't want to do this. I really probably shouldn't be doing this because it's not good to boast, and I don't want to boast. And it's like Paul has never revealed this information to the Corinthians, and they're forcing him to do it because he cares more about their souls than he cares about the reward that he'll have for keeping all these things to himself. And so he explains how he was shipwrecked, how he was stoned, how he was imprisoned, and all the different sufferings and trials that he's gone through. And whenever you read through that, you're just like, wow, it's just the story of Paul's ministry, his life, that's found in these chapters that we wouldn't even know that some of those things that he suffered. I mean, Acts tells us a lot, but we wouldn't know some of those things that he suffered if he didn't explain them to the Corinthians. And all of that really is a reinforcer to Christians everywhere that it's not about the comfortable life. It's not about enjoying the most you can get in this life. It's about laying it all down in order to serve Christ. And that's a really hard thing, I think, for us as Americans to lay down the things that we enjoy, the privileges that we have as American citizens, and the wonderful hobbies and every family time all this stuff that we enjoy, that Paul was willing to lay down to serve Christ happily, because that's what the image bearer of God, the one who's transformed by the glory of Jesus, that's what he does. He sacrifices the heavenly privileges in order to suffer to serve other people. So that's the story that I love most out of all the stories in these books.
Well, when I put this together and I thought about who was going to be talking, I said, well, the obvious story, the only story I thought, is the story of this fornicating man who is talked about in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, and then he's revisited in 2 Corinthians also. Well, there's a story, and I started thinking, no, actually, there are a few more, and I was looking actually at this so-called story in somewhat smaller picture. I was thinking more about like the thorn in the flesh, more specifically. Yeah. But you do a really good job of pointing out here that this is part of a larger narrative that even escapes 1 and 2 Corinthians to a certain degree, although he probably talks about it here better than he talks about it anywhere else. And remember also that he's writing this in the middle of the book of Acts. Half of the really nasty stuff that he encounters in the book of Acts is not recorded here. The shipwreck that we read about here, the night and day he spent in the deep, that's not the shipwreck of Acts 27. That's something else that Acts doesn't tell us about. So it's, and of course, after Acts concludes, Paul has sufferings yet beyond that, including his own death. And so I really appreciate your point bringing this up. It's such a, it's a hard life. It's a good life, but it's a hard life, and we need to appreciate that. And I have greatly feared, though I'm not volunteering to give up my privileges as an American citizen by any stretch. Paul didn't give up his as a Roman citizen either, for that matter.
That's true.
But the idea that I could be better off, I could be a more effective servant if I wasn't quite as comfortable, if I wasn't quite as conscious of my rights, advancing my rights, protecting my rights and such, that I might be able to serve the kingdom better in a different circumstance. I push away from that narrative. I don't want to get involved in that. I'm comfortable where I am. I am hopeful, prayerful that it not get any worse. But Paul's such a great reminder that if it does get worse, that's not the end of the world. We're not rooting for it to get worse, but it could get worse. And generally it does get worse. And that's okay, because as he says there in that great verse in chapter 12, my grace is sufficient for you. If we trust in Jesus in these hard times, we're going to come away from these hard times, supposed hard times. Maybe it's not appropriate to call our hard times hard in comparison with Paul, but we come away from these challenges stronger, refined in the fire. We're more committed. That it's going to find the ones who are truly faithful and strengthen them and sharpen them and improve their service.
Absolutely. And you stole my verse, which is fine.
Sorry.
But that's absolutely right. I mean, it's not that we want the world to go, for life to get uncomfortable for us. I mean, that's not really the goal, it's not what we're shooting for. But there's a recognition that if we're going to serve Christ like he wants to be served, if we're going to actually reach out to the lost and try to build up our, the world around us and restore the hope of heaven in the lives of those around us, it's probably not going to be met with, the most comfortable life. It's not that you're going to get to go home every day and binge watch Netflix. It's not that you're going to be doing, whatever you want to do all the time. You're going to devote the time that's needed in order to evangelize, in order to be with your brethren and build up the weak. I mean, there's just so much work that we can do that I think we sacrifice the work for our comfort instead of sacrificing our comfort for the work. And I enjoy a lot of comfort. I enjoy a lot of hobbies. I enjoy my family time. But I have to have priorities. That's something that I work on constantly, that I struggle with constantly. It's not something I've got completely figured out, but it is something that I think Paul, pushes us toward in this, in 2 Corinthians. And by telling that story, I think he wants the Corinthians to understand, they're not here to serve themselves. I think sometimes people take 2 Corinthians as Paul explaining his ministry in a way that would be self-serving. And it's like, no, he's not. I mean, I understand he's defending himself to the false apostles in some ways, but this is not a self-serving thing. He just wrote 1 Corinthians to say, it's not about you. Don't be selfish. He's really still trying to encourage them to be selfless. He doesn't list his accomplishments of all the people he saved or anything like that. He's talking about living a sacrificial life in service to God, to encourage them to do the same thing. And I think that's really important.
I totally agree. And I look at this little window in the middle of all the suffering that Paul talks about. He doesn't even put his name on it, but it's pretty obvious that it's him in the context.
Yeah.
I know somebody who was caught up into heaven and viewed paradise and saw things that I can't even express. That our life is kind of like that too. I think we emphasize the negative, we emphasize the suffering, and then the hardships, and we pray for them to get for them to pass, and maybe they do, maybe they don't. And every once in a while, we get this little glimmer of heaven. Maybe it's a worship service, maybe it's a personal request that's been answered, maybe it's time with family, whatever it happens to be. I use the word heavenly very cautiously. I have gotten to where it's not appropriate to talk about pumpkin pie as being heavenly, or something along those lines. It's not heavenly; it's earthly. There are heavenly things on earth. There are not that many of them, but there are, and they're wonderful. And when we get that little bit of insight into spiritual realms, when we catch a little glimpse of heaven, you don't want to overstate it, but it really kind of makes all the rest of it seem worthwhile. I'm not wasting my time with this. This is how good it can be, and I have faith that it's going to get much, much better than this. Yeah. But I have to stick it out. I have to endure the hard times.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think that's true. I think God definitely is building us up himself. Like he's working to show us how, and give us a taste. He wants us to understand. And the word is full of that. I mean, really, as we study, I think the more we study and the more we understand about God, the more in touch with the things above we get, and that's Colossians, is all about, set your minds on things above, not on things on the earth. It's all about that kind of being in touch with the heavenly truths that are yours. Ephesians, you're blessed with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places. We need to be constantly thinking about and focusing on those things. But what Paul says here and what he does, that explanation of his vision and what he sees, that whole thing is a very fascinating part. And I think that was definitely a top contender to just kind of narrow down. But I like the whole for the message that it sends to us. So that's the one I went with.
Excellent. Well, what verse might you have in mind that you would want to focus on?
Yeah. So the verse, as I said earlier, is 12. Right? That's okay. That's because it's a great verse. I mean, that just backs up that it is a great verse. So 12, verse 9, he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me." Love this verse. This verse is encouragement for everyone who is poor in spirit, everyone who is maybe seeing their churches dwindle. It kind of reminds you of all the Old Testament stories of, armies being dwindled down to just 300 or something like, and then God accomplishing the victory through the 300 or through just a man or just a few men, because it's not about the strength of the man. In fact, God prefers to work with weakness. So I really like this verse as Paul points that out, because, we'll look at ourselves and we'll just beat ourselves up and say, who am I? What am I doing? This is everything I do seems to fail, and I'm a nobody, and that's exactly where God can be the most successful. And that's the point when we're supposed to stop thinking, I've got to do this and I've got to do that, and I can do this if I just devote myself. And we start thinking, I can't do anything unless God is with me and unless God helps me. And then we start to really give praise to God and glorify him in whatever it is that we actually do. So I think that's really what this verse is pointing to as Paul is writing it. The thorn in the flesh, the thorn in his side is whatever that is a reminder of Paul that he can't do it on his own. He needs God's help. And as great an apostle as Paul is, he needed that reminder. And so I think that's a really powerful verse in all of it. And as Corinthians, they needed to hear that because they failed so much, and they need to understand it's not about you and your ability. As you look at 2 Corinthians, it's about God working through you to accomplish his will. So
I love that. That's such a great concept, especially for Americans. I mean, you were touching on this a little bit earlier.
yeah,
It's so easy for us. We have trained ourselves for 250 years almost to assume that life can get better, and even we might even fool ourselves into thinking life can get more righteous, life can get more holy
yeah,
if we accomplish some kind of change in the carnal realm.
yeah,
and and I would argue that's never been the case. And
right,
because we're changing things around us, we're not necessarily changing souls. I'm not sure that
yeah,
prohibition saved anybody's soul. I'm not, if we ever banned abortion, I don't know if that would save anybody's soul. This is making the life around us more comfortable, more accommodating for a
yeah,
Christian lifestyle, which traditionally, historically, has not necessarily been the greatest thing. and
right,
and so we get so lost in, well, if we could just elect the right president, or just elect the right Congress, or appoint the right judges, or get the right law passed, or whatever, if we could just join the right political action committee, or commit enough money to this cause or that cause or whatever, our world would get so much better. And maybe it would, but we're not drawing closer to God that way. And sometimes our failures in those areas, and in my personal judgment, we've gotten a lot of them recently, the failures that we are encountering in this life are opportunities for us to lean on where we should have been leaning in the first place. We should have been trusting in Jesus through all of this. And sometimes we run out of options, and all that we can do is trust in Jesus. And it turns out to be a blessing in the midst of the curse. I wish it didn't
yeah,
take that. I wish we could have our cake and eat it too. But
yeah,
maybe it doesn't work that way. And if we have
yeah.
to choose between God's grace and physical justice, or whatever we want to call it, let's hope we have enough faith to choose grace.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the Isaiah 55 text, "My ways are not your ways, nor my thoughts your thoughts." We think we can establish a community, a Christian kind of community that affects the external, and and then the internal will take care of itself. That's not really the way it works. It's the opposite. We need to focus on the internal, and so I think what God has done in our society is actually created an internal longing with the materialism and the secularism that we face in our society that is actually much more um, uh, appealing. The gospel is much more appealing to that person because it provides eternal satisfaction and joy and peace that all these things are very obviously not going to provide. So, and I don't think I would have come up with that, or I don't think men could come up with that. I think that's because God knows what's best, that He's turning the world that way to help them see and come back to him
Right.
with the heart, not the external show.
It makes for a rotten movie. Nobody wants to
Yeah.
see this movie where the bad guys win and the innocent suffer and go to their deathbed saying, "Well, I trust in Jesus and heaven is my home and it's all well with me," and a big smile on my face. It's like that makes a rotten movie. Nobody wants to see that, and we don't want to live that. We want victory that we can see, that we can taste, that we can gloat over. And Jesus doesn't offer that to us sometimes, and that's okay. We have to find contentment in that. We have to find joy in that. Jesus found joy at the end of the cross. If he can find joy at the end of the cross, surely we can find joy carrying our cross.
Yeah. Yeah, because he knew what it would result in the end. He knew that it would help people, and he knew that he was going to be glorified with God in heaven when this life was over. And I think we need to understand the same thing. Hebrews talks about this, that he's the pioneer. He's the one who is the founder and perfecter of our faith. He shows us that suffering is the path to glory. I think that's throughout the book of Hebrews, kind of showing us that. And we just have to be willing to accept that truth, that we live in a messed up world that's going to be focused on, this world. And we shouldn't expect it to be different. We should be working within it to convert souls to Christ always. It's not about kicking back our feet and relaxing because we live in a Christian country. It's about continually be working until this life is over and we get to rest in heaven with God. So.
And allow me to embellish a little bit on the idea of suffering and drawing closer to God because of suffering. Because I think a lot of people can develop, again with the movies thing, can develop a very shallow concept of suffering. That taking 40 lashes in the town square and not crying out and just kind of looking with plaintive eyes toward your oppressors and saying, "I forgive you." That's what suffering is all about. And sometimes it has been, but usually.
Yeah.
It's much more mundane than that. It's much more subtle than that. It's the wrong law gets passed, or my boss is mean to me, doesn't give me the raise that I thought I was going to get. How do we bear up under these circumstances, especially when the circumstances are a result of us standing for the truth? We did the right thing and we're suffering for it. Well, I'm okay with that, but I'm going to whine about it for a while. I'm gonna fuss about it for a while. It's the whole do everything without grumbling or complaining. We just kind of skip over that. Philippians is a great book, but we don't want to pay attention to that verse there because we want to complain about things if they're going bad, and that's not what suffering for the Lord looks like. That's not what Jesus did. That's not what the apostles did, and we need to find a way to not do it either.
Yeah, we need to rejoice in the Lord always.
Exactly.
We don't need to be, and Paul exemplifies that, and it's not about grumbling and complaining and all of that. We're missing the opportunity that we have to actually show our faith. If we rejoice like the apostles did after they were beaten for Christ, they were rejoicing that they were able to suffer for preaching the gospel and teaching people about Christ. So I mean, a lot of the things that we suffer is not really for the cause of Christ. It's just part of living in a messed up world.
Very true.
But if we ever do get to suffer because we're a Christian, we should certainly be rejoicing in that because it's an opportunity to share in Christ's sufferings. So that's really cool.
All right. Well, I apologize for stealing your thunder a little bit on the verse. Hopefully, I have not stolen the word yet.
Well, I had 3 words.
Okay.
So I'm going to rank them. I'm going to go ahead and pick the top one,
Right.
which is nothing to do with what we've been talking about and gives a little love to 1 Corinthians. So love is the word that I chose, which brings us back to 1 Corinthians 13. And really that text is primarily talking about loving your brethren, because it's in the midst of all this discussion about spiritual gifts that are given and using your gifts in a way that shows love, instead of being self-serving. He says, if I have all the riches and I don't have love, then I have nothing. If I can do all these works but don't have love, it accomplishes nothing. So I love the love passage like everybody does, but I think sometimes we pull it out to use for a lot of different things, which I think is okay. Because if you think about 1st and 2nd Corinthians, love is really the basis of it all. Paul's love for the Corinthians, that he is patient with them, he is kind toward them. He doesn't assume the worst in them. He's exemplifying what he says there in 1 Corinthians 13. And it's out of his love for God. The two greatest commandments are to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbors yourself. And I think that these letters they revolve around the two commandments. He's trying to push the Corinthians to love God more than they love this world, and he's trying to push them to love one another as Jesus has loved them. So, love.
I I love it when I I'm listening to somebody else talk or whatever, and suddenly my mind goes off on a tangent and says, you know what, this would make a really good 3 point outline if we did something like that. And I
Yeah.
was thinking about the love, as you said, it's correct that this is talking about love of brethren, but it's also talking about love in general. If this is what love looks like as applied to brethren, it ought to look that way when applied to anything else. And do we
Yeah.
love Jesus this way? Is this the way that we love Jesus? Of course, this passage has been quoted any number of times with regard to marriage. Is this the way that you love your
Mhm.
spouse? Are we being selfless? Are we coming to these relationships out of mutual interest, out of service, out of genuine concern, or are we just kind of milking them for all that they're worth? Because there are people who treat the brethren like that way. There who would never pick up a phone or send a card or anything to save their life, but if they don't get cards when they're sick, they fuss about it. Uh, it's a self-serving relationship. It's all taking and no giving. And if we're that way with one another, surely that we're that way with Jesus. It's all about what Jesus can do for me, and I'm not especially interested in what I can do for Jesus. I put him on in baptism. What more do you want, Jesus? It's the idea of giving to somebody else, and marriages. How could you possibly have a marriage where it's all taking and no giving? We say that all the time, and what happened to them? Well, they got selfish. Is what it is, and love is kind of the opposite of selfishness, isn't it?
That's the only marriage advice I got was don't be selfish, which yeah, that was it. And whenever I got it, I was like, that's all I'm getting from anybody. I was like, this is not enough. And it wasn't. We struggled the first 3 years, and then I finally saw the selfishness
Yeah.
that was in me. And I finally understood, because I started studying the Bible and started understanding a little bit more about love and what it really is. That's exactly what it's about. Those two things are opposed to each other, and we have to understand that.
Well, I
So,
love First and
yeah,
Second Corinthians. Did I cut you off? I'm sorry.
yeah. Um,
I love this
no,
passage,
it's good. It's good. I do too.
and
The amazing. Yeah.
it's been a joy talking. I hope everybody has a happy Thanksgiving. I hope Casey gets some sleep with his newborn in the house. He's besought
Oh,
with care,
yeah.
I'm sure, but it's a blessing, and we're grateful for that. So thank you very much for listening. I hope everybody is able to tune in next week and talk about a whole passel of shorter books instead of two large books. Until then, thank you very much for being here, and keep reading.